What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for The Adventures of Elliot, the Millennium Tales, a game that is definitely a throwback to older Zelda titles that very likely inspired it. But before we dive in fully, a few things to know there. I'm sure pretty much everybody knows at this point that I review games after 100% all the time. My Steam profile is public and linked down below, and there is also a video linked down below covering everything I go over as well. Now, in the case of this particular title, I do need to inform you that while it did in fact release on June 18th, and you're seeing this video a few days later, I did receive a review key for this right as the game released from Square Enix, which is pretty par for the course for them. They really love to give me the review keys on release day. That said, it's also not a very long game. If I was not specifically trying to 100% this, I would have easily cleared it in sub 20 hours. I actually had played a demo on top of that prior to the game's release, and the demo progress carried forward, which saved me a few hours, and then beyond just the story, there's like maybe 10 or so extra hours of content. So all in all, just a short, relatively easy title to 100%, as once you get a little ways into the game, they give you a magic compass that you can find needles for, which will literally point you to everything, including the collectibles. So as 100% go, very straightforward. Now, before I dive into the rest of this from here, I do want to be upfront that there will be some, I would consider them light spoilers throughout this video, both contextual stuff in the footage, yes, but also in order to make a few points I want to talk about, I do have to explain a couple things that some people might find spoilerish, just so you are aware. Now, talking a little more specifically about the game itself, The Adventures of Elliot here is an interesting case where I actually didn't have it on my radar at all prior to playing the demo, and then I enjoyed the demo so much that I would give it the time for this review, and unfortunately, despite the game not even being that long, I don't think it manages to spend that time super well. That is to say, it gets repetitive by the end of it, and the reason for that, in large part, is because this game is called the Millennium Tales, because technically the story takes place over 1,000 years, and you're jumping between 4 different distinct ages in this kingdom's history. Now, the problem there is the maps for each age are relatively small, and they are all the same map, meaning that they overlap, and there's very little difference from one map to the next outside of the major sort of town area. Like literally all the dungeons, the paths forward, that stuff stays the same. Like the dungeons are only fully completable in the appropriate age that they are meant to be completed in, and then in the other ages there's like a short pathway to a singular chest usually. Combine that with a story whose most interesting parts don't come until the game's successive endings, and you've got a situation where they are charging $60 for a game that realistically probably should have been like $40 max. Now, that's not to say it's bad, it's an enjoyable experience, there's just not $60 worth of game here, and unfortunately its drawbacks are a little too prevalent to really justify spending $60 on. So let's talk a little more about that over the course of the rest of this review, starting with the technical state. A couple of things to mention here. This game crashed a lot for me on transitions, so like when you're entering or exiting a dungeon or jumping from one age to the next, I had a fair few crashes during those transition periods. Not sure exactly why, I wouldn't say they were so common as to make the game unplayable or anything, and it was certainly a little annoying, but thankfully to the game's autosaves, you never really lost much progress, but a nuisance at the very least. Then there is your NPC companion's voice. So, throughout the game, you're going to be at first accompanied by the princess, and then after a certain story point, your fairy companion. Neither of these two know how to be quiet. That is to say, they talk constantly, and before somebody jumps into the comment section about it, yes, there is in fact an option to turn that talkativeness down. However, it doesn't seem to work. Or if it does work, it makes almost no difference at all because they still yap incessantly, often to the tune of just spoiling puzzles the moment you arrive at them, stating the obvious, and just otherwise, constantly talking. And it's definitely to the game's detriment, and I just kind of wish they would take that optional bit and go a little bit farther and allow you to turn most of it off. Another thing I want to point out here before we move on is that your fairy companion is a character that you actually control on the battlefield. You'll be using her magic and activating it to use in combat or to solve puzzles. And on keyboard and mouse, you have 2 different ways of directing the fairy companion. You can either use IJKL or you can hit left control and use your mouse to direct them. And there are situations where one or the other is more effective, and it took me a little while to figure out that that was like something you could swap out, so I just wanted to point it out somewhere in here. But let's keep it moving. Next up, we've got difficulty. Now, this game does feature easy, normal, hard difficulty. However, it's a relatively relaxed game overall, if you couldn't tell by the general vibe of it. And your fairy companion, Faye, is very capable of just reviving you if you die in combat at the cost of some money, which gets successively more expensive the more you die. But it is possible to use that in order to mostly breeze your way through the game. The only exception to this is the trials, and more specifically the hero's trial you need to clear for the achievement. That is a boss rush that you have to do without being able to be revived, but you can just bring in a bunch of potions with you, so it's also not super difficult. So yes, there are difficulty options, but it's a tame game pretty across the board. Next up, let's talk story setup and my thoughts on it. So we, of course, play as Elliot, as this is the Adventures of Elliot. It'd be odd if we were playing somebody else. Like, imagine naming your entire series after a particular character that winds up not being the one you're playing at all. But Elliot here is in fact an orphan in the kingdom of Huther, which is set in the world of, I kid you not, it's like Philabeldia, which is painfully close to Philadelphia, but neither here nor there, I guess. Either way, the kingdom of Huther is kept safe from the beast tribes outside of its walls by the spell of safekeeping, which is kept intact by the princess of the realm. The beast tribes and humans have been at war for a very long time, and there's a lot of animosity there, and so it's generally not safe for humans to venture out. And so when some new ruins are discovered and they need someone to investigate them, they call for the best adventurer in the land, which just so happens to be you, Elliot. Now, as you explore those ruins, you're going to discover the possibility of magic, only for the scheming right hand of the king, Kaifried, to basically go crazy and use the portal to another age that was found in these ruins to try to usurp the throne. And as important as that sounds, he actually winds up being a relatively minor character, and the story goes in much bigger places from here in what stretches a 1,000-year tale. Now, I want to mention a couple of extra things here. So I did mention briefly that there are successive endings there. If you simply follow the main objectives until credits roll, you will get the bad ending. There are two others. They all kind of build off of each other. So when you get the bad ending, you can then load that save, be given pretty direct hints about what to do to get the next ending, which is the normal ending, and then once you do that one and load that save, you can do a bit more work yet and finally get the true ending. And then once you get the true ending done, you can load that save back up and go gather up anything you happen to have missed. Now, the problem with this game's story, so to speak, is that most of it isn't like super engaging. That's the kind of game where you're really more in it for the gameplay more so than the narrative, I'll admit. But I think that's especially noteworthy here because almost all of the interesting stuff happens between the bad ending and the true ending. And I think that's a shame for a game that has a good chunk of it before that point. Especially since once people roll credits and if they don't like the ending, there's a good chance they won't play it through to get the other two endings to begin with. And it's just a bit of a weird structure where, again, all of the good stuff is right at the end. And because of the way it's put forward, a lot of people might not even see it. And then what you're left with is a pretty generic sort of JRPG storyline where you're trying to save the kingdom by making sure this magic is sustainable in the long term when the princess starts having problems and all this sort of usual stuff. And I just think it's a shame that the most interesting parts are the last couple of hours after a mostly kind of middling story throughout. But long story short, I think the story is okay. Ironically, the character that grabbed me the most, Kaifried, wound up not even really being all that important to the larger narrative, so is what it is, I suppose. Moving on to progression. This game has a lot of it. You'll have to excuse me if I miss any of it, but most of this is done via successive upgrades. So we start the game with a few drops of life, and over the course of the game, we'll be picking up shards of life, and for every 4 of those we find, we get an extra heart up to the maximum of 20. Eventually, you will get your hands on magic via Faye. Once she joins you, you can learn up to 5 spells at various points throughout the story, and these are going to enable usually like puzzles and also some combat stuff. You get a little teleport one, a clone one, which I actually thought was pretty interesting. There's a vacuum spell that hoovers things up around you, a fire spell to simply light things on fire, which can actually one-shot a couple of enemies, and each of those magic spells can then be enhanced to add an extra effect to whatever it does. But then there are are weapons. So while you have a sort of base sword and shield, you can actually get a whole bunch of other weapons like a spear, a bow, bombs, a boomerang, a chain and sickle, which was actually a lot of fun, and each of those plays a little bit differently and actually has several upgrades itself. So you will eventually find just straight upgrades to those weapons in the form of newer, better weapons in a linear fashion. Each weapon has 2 upgrades, and then there are also things like upgrades to the carrying capacity for, say, arrows or your overall bomb count. To make that even crazier, we then have one of the main things, which is Magicite. So as we kill enemies and bosses in particular, we'll be gathering up Magicite, and Magicite can be spent at a special vendor to both increase your capacity to use it, but also form the Magicite itself into usable little chunks, and what you can then do is equip these to your weapons based on the size of your Magicite box. Equipping these to weapons grants them all sorts of unique effects and abilities, and overall I would say there's a couple of different builds you can lean into for each weapon to make them play a little differently, which goes a long way towards varying up combat, which we'll talk about. And then there are accessories as well. So these are often quest rewards in particular, but can also be found and bought. Accessories usually have large gameplay effects of their own, such as potentially doubling the amount of Magicite or money you are earning from killing enemies, blocking certain effects, making you immune to certain things, extending the duration of buffs, just all sorts of stuff. You can initially only equip one of those by completing some trials that unlock later in the game. You can unlock 2 extra spots, and so you are, via one of those means, pretty much always discovering and upgrading things right until the very end. But that does bring us to the gameplay and world section. So, as I mentioned, this game is split up across 4 different time periods or ages as the story progresses. And across those ages, you are pretty freely able to travel outside of a few story moments. They do this by providing you guideposts or checkpoints throughout the land, both strategically throughout the overworld map and then in dungeons as well. You can fast travel between these even in the dungeons, like there's usually one at the start of a dungeon that you can fast travel to from inside the dungeon to quickly exit or enter, alongside just fast traveling the overworld. Now, the guideposts right outside of a city have a red orb that will heal you when you touch them, and these guideposts also serve as your main save point. The game does autosave fairly frequently, but not always, and so it's important to remember to save at these things every once in a while. And then the rest of it is really often tied to story progression. So there are, of course, parts of the map as you move through it that you won't be able to initially unlock across the different ages. Now the catch is, once you unlock it in one age, you are then able to go there across all ages. And this can typically be something like a character giving you a key to a door in a cave, and then suddenly you can open that door in every age. Now what that unfortunately leads to is a lot of repetition. You are unfortunately exploring what is effectively the same map 4 times in a row in order to get all of your upgrades and resources, etc. as you move through the story, assuming you're even bothering to do that and not just beelining it. But still, this often means that the reward you get for doing some of this progression and exploring things is just exploring the same area with the exact same layout and routes through as you have probably multiple times up to that point, and it gets repetitive fast. Now, luckily, we do have some proper side quests to keep us engaged. There are, I believe it was like 33 of them, give or take, and each of those side quests contributes a bit to the world building, kind of explaining what is going on in each individual age, what these characters are up to, what they're trying to accomplish, and what society has looked like as it has ebbed and flowed over the 1,000 years the game takes place in. It also, of course, tries to flesh out the characters that you meet along the way, and the reward for doing these is often things like accessories, upgrades to your bomb or arrow capacity, that kind of stuff. The other side of this, of course, being the dungeons. Throughout these realms, you're going to find a bunch of dungeons, and as I mentioned, they can only be fully completed in the age they are meant to be completed in. Otherwise, you'll usually only find like a single chest and ultimately not be able to proceed past a certain point. Most of these dungeons are full of course, enemies and puzzles, the puzzles often requiring a certain amount of story progression for you to get up to that point. There are dungeons that are optional in the sense that completing them will simply give you the reward of, say, stronger weapons, progress, etc., so you don't even necessarily need to do all of them. But most of these felt pretty intuitive and fun enough to explore. usually each featuring like a unique mechanic or two along the way, and I think that overall gameplay feel and loop is what is mostly going to keep you coming back. Now, that said, moving on to combat a little bit, combat has more going on than you might initially think, but it's also not a particularly complicated endeavor, as you're basically going to pick a weapon you like, attack or charge attack with it, but you can equip 2 weapons generally at any one time that you can freely swap between all of them, and then use your magic on top of those. And then from there, it's really all about how you've built each weapon individually with your magicite in order to produce interesting effects. For instance, there are several ways you can utilize bombs in this particular game. So one of the upgrades allows you to reset the counter every time you pick one up, meaning that it's really easy to just pick them up and move them. You can also make them much larger and take longer to explode, or have them shoot fireworks which deal extra damage, or have just coming into contact with them damage enemies, or have them leave a giant lava pool when they explode. Something like the spear has the option of leaning into like the charge attacks, or creating fire fields, or allowing you to charge farther. Your sword allows you to potentially power up and use distance slashes every time you attack, or deal damage even when you perfectly guard against an enemy, as an example. So each individual weapon has a bunch of different stuff you can do with it in order to make it play differently. And that's before you start bringing magic into the equation. So Faye can ignite and light enemies on fire. There's a particular bomb enemy that this instantly kills. Later on, she gets a vacuum spell that will, of course, vacuum up all of the enemies into a central location, which is a great thing to do if you want to reel them into a bomb, because Faye does not take damage. You get a clone spell later that allows her to simply duplicate your actions and the like, and that was an interesting one to play around with. And again, so combat is really just all about the different ways you can take all of those elements and find fun things to do with them, which more often than not, through experimentation, is some of the best of what this game's got going on. Outside of that, it's really down to enemy types and bosses. So enemy types are pretty basic. A little later in the game, you can find berserk enemies, which are stronger than normal but have extra drops. Your weapon upgrades and everything that deal extra damage are, of course, what you want to have when you are dealing with these guys, but the bosses are where it gets interesting. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of repetition in these bosses as well. There is a couple of early game bosses you're going to fight just over and over and over again, but a couple of them were pretty fun to actually fight and had interesting mechanics and stuff, so a bit of a mixed bag there, I guess you could say. Now, that stuff said, that does bring us to our Steam Deck section. If you couldn't tell by looking at it, this game is, of course, verified on the Steam Deck. It plays very well there. If anything, I would say titles like this kind of feel more at home on handhelds than they do on PC or consoles, at least to me anyway. But yeah, you shouldn't have any problem playing this on the Steam Deck. And so we'll go ahead and move on to the positives, negatives, and then wrap this thing up. So on the positive side, it simply must be said I'm a big fan of the art. I really love the HD 2D graphics. I've said this many times when I talk about these games, but I really do just love that art style. I know it's not for everybody, but man, I just love that. And then, of course, there's the general gameplay, actually exploring these dungeons, getting all these upgrades, messing around with these weapons, and seeing what's possible there in terms of, like, combat and stuff, and then going through individual trials, and even most of the areas the first time you explore them, as opposed to the second, third, and fourth at the end of the day, is usually pretty fun, and that general gameplay loop is decent, if a little short. However, we do unfortunately have a few negatives. For starters, the repetition. Unfortunately, exploring this world 4 times ultimately across one game in relatively short succession is not a super engaging experience when extraordinarily little changes between them, and at times you're even fighting the same boss in multiple encounters, and that on top of things like the crashes that I was experiencing personally but may not be widespread, I admit, and then the NPCs that will not stop talking even when you go into the menu and choose the option that is supposed to make them talk less. And suddenly you've got a game that isn't even that long to begin with and still kind of manages to start overstaying its welcome. Which then brings me to my conclusion. Now, despite those negatives, I don't want you to think this game is terrible or anything. I had fun with this one. The catch really just is that this would be a fun game for like $40, but it's not a great one for $60. It just doesn't have the content or scope to justify a $60 price tag, and suddenly all of those problems become a bit of a bigger deal. So to me, this is just one of those situations where the price tag is just not in line with what the game is, and it becomes a bit of an issue. So while I would be happy to recommend it for $40, at $60 I've really got to give this one a buy on sale, which is where I think we are going to go ahead and wrap up this particular review. So hopefully you enjoyed all that or found it useful. If you did, or if you've been playing the game yourself, I'd love to know what you think about it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.